Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Jaime Bean. I'm a member of the 2021 Charles Bronfman Convener Cohort, and I am born and raised and currently live in the suburbs of Detroit. I'd like to welcome you to the session, Democratic Decline or Rejuvenation, the State of American and Israeli Democracy. We are so lucky to be joined today by two distinguished speakers. Yaël Mizrahi-Arnaud is a research fellow at the Forum for Regional Thinking and David Hartman Center, as well as a doctoral student at NYU. Dr. Ned Lazarus is a visiting professor of international affairs and an Israel Institute teaching fellow at the George Washington University, specializing in conflict resolution and Israeli-Palestinian peace building. Just so you guys know, we're going to ask a few questions and then we're going to open it up to the broader group. So if you want to save your questions till we're done, that'd be great. So Yaël, we will start with you. A few years ago, you co-authored a report answering the question of whether Israel is in democratic decline. That was in 2019, when Israel had a more populist leader. Where would you say Israel stands now in terms of democratic decline?
So hi, Jaime and everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm going to speak a little bit, but I'm actually really looking forward to the conversation after and to hearing your questions. Yes, I co-authored a report in 2019 with Tamara Kaufman-Wittes that was, kind of at the height of this, question of populism taking over Western democracies and, how we should deal with that. So with regards to Israel, you know that Israel currently has a new prime minister and a national unity government. So Netanyahu is for now at least out of the picture. And he was the, populist leader that we were focused on. But I think to take a step back when discussing populism, it's important to recognize that there are really two distinct types that we discussed in the paper. The literature is very vast and is super interesting, but just to bring it to the bare bones, there are the two types that we would look at would be thin versus thick. And one of them is more dangerous for democracy than the other. So the thin type of populism, which is, putting it simply, a type of messaging that leaders would use to stand up for the marginalized at the hands of political elites. So this would be, rhetoric that we've seen from a range of Israeli leaders on the right and the left, when it's advancing, either economic reform or, trying to stand up for, marginalized Mizrahim or other groups in Israeli society. And then the more problematic kind is the thick populism, which is dangerous because of its exclusionary nature. So it would undermine democratic politics, specifically by, trying to legally define some citizens as outside of the true nation, which means that they wouldn't be provided the same rights as others. So I don't want to get too bogged down in this, but it's important because while Netanyahu is no longer in power, and many of the threats that Israel's democracy was facing in 2019 prior, and the populist rhetoric that he was using was really to rally the right wing behind him. And he was, looking for a popular and political support in order to, advance certain right wing agendas, but also largely his interests were at escaping prosecution for his corruption charges, which included a very concerted attempt to undermine the judiciary and the legal system, but it was also clearly connected to larger right-wing agendas. And despite Netanyahu no longer being in the picture, those agendas still exist and are being used and are, still, I guess, prevalent in the discussion of Israeli politics. So as a caveat before I get into the question about Israel, particularly, I need to mention that we can't really have a conversation about the state of Israeli democracy without mentioning the occupation, the system of Israel's military and physical control of Palestinians in the West Bank. Because while these territories haven't been formally annexed to be part of Israel, they still remain under Israeli control. And Israeli actions there certainly have implications for Israeli politics and society within the Green Line, so within 1948. And we know that events happening in East Jerusalem, as in the house demolitions and expropriations in Sheikh Jarrah, for example, can lead to war, as we saw in May, which only exacerbates Israel's other challenges. So we're going to be focusing on things that are happening inside Israel proper. I think that's important to mention. So yeah, now that Netanyahu is out of the political picture for the moment, though there's a whole discussion about what are the implications of a potential plea deal that he could take, Israel is still facing a host of challenges, some of which we weren't previously aware of, and some that we didn't have time to focus on, perhaps because Netanyahu was waging such an open battle against the most important institutions of democracy. And so, some of the other things maybe were swept under the rug or just didn't have the public's attention. I will go into the specific arenas where I think that we still see threats to Israeli democracy, perhaps later, but I think that we should always start off maybe with, the bright spots. So where we see Israel's democracy is maybe, moving forward in a positive direction, burgeoning into, new models that are positive and that bring us to look at, democracy as moving forward constructively. So it's clear that after what seemed like an unending round of 4 election cycles and political deadlock, and the way that Netanyahu was, controlling the government despite his, criminal issues, the fact that there is a national unity government is a huge achievement. It's also just Israel's most diverse coalition to date. The fact that, there is the Islamist Arab Ram party as part of the coalition for the first time in Israel's history. It's also quite unique to see Meretz and Labor on the left wing, sitting in the same government as the far right, Yisrael Beitenu and Yamina. You also have a range of Arab ministers, which isn't a first, but they do hold important posts, such as Meretz's Isawi Frej being the Minister of Regional Cooperation. You also have Mansour Abbas, head of the Ram party, who's Deputy Minister of Arab Affairs, and Labor's Ibtisam Marana as head of a special Knesset committee on foreign workers. There's also then the rotational prime ministership, where Yair Lapid from Yesh Atid is set to become prime minister in September 2023, inshallah. And Israel hasn't had a prime minister from the center left-wing party in over a decade. And it's almost 2 decades since it's been someone actually from the left, since Ehud Barak. So I think I'll stop there, and yeah, we can talk about the threats after.
Awesome. Thank you, Yael. So Ned, what impact, if any, does the Israeli-Palestinian conflict have on the democratic nature of Israel and the strength of its democracy?
Thanks, Jaime, and thanks, Yael, for framing that and saying some of the things that I would have said. I mean, where does it start and where does it end? The conflict affects every aspect, and I think largely because of the conflict, Israel is a democracy with an asterisk for all of its history in different ways. Now, when I say that, the asterisk, just as Yael was speaking about, there are positives to see and there are negatives. I think that you can see Israel in a half empty or half full light in light of the conflict, meaning given all of the pressures, the extraordinary pressures of this conflict that have changed and evolved throughout history, but are always there. You could say that Israel is a rather robust democracy given that state of constant emergency, of threats, of security, preparedness, of minority-majority relations that are particularly tense and fraught because of the conflict, given the occupation, given all of these things. Someone might say it's somewhat extraordinary, and given the region where Israel is located and to which its populations are most connected to, which is an undemocratic region. So for all, in all of those contexts, it would appear rather extraordinary the degree of democratic procedures, democratic freedoms, democratic culture that exists in Israel. That's sort of the half full way to look at it. And the half empty way to look at it is also quite strong. Israel has only existed as a state for 1 year in which a large part of the people under its control did not live under military government. For the first 18 years, 1948 to 66, the Arab citizens lived under military government. They did have voting rights and other democratic rights, but their citizenship was certainly lesser and much more restricted and limited than that of Jewish Israelis. When the military government was abolished in 1966, and it should be said through the lobbying of Israeli politicians, both from right and left, Menachem Begin was in fact a great opponent of the military government and argued vociferously for it to be abolished. When it was finally abolished in 1966, 1 year later, Israel conquered the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, and the occupation began, and the unending sort of paradox of a democratic state ruling undemocratically over millions of Palestinians, of people who ostensibly don't want to be its citizens, and it doesn't want as its citizens, but with a territorial claim and conflict that remains unresolved and keeps them in that limbo. Of course, many things have happened since that origin in 1967. But the point is that even before the state, the Israeli proto-democratic institutions of the Yishuv developed in an atmosphere, in a context of nationalist conflict, of impending competition for control of land and resources, and for ultimately for statehood within the territory. So Israel's democracy has never existed really without being in a state of pretty extreme conflict. So in terms of how I think it affects democracy, particularly today, after so many years, decades, more than 50 years in particular, of the undemocratic rule over the Palestinians, you have different ways in which you would measure democracy, right? You have individual liberties, you have press freedom, you have democratic culture, sort of liberal democratic culture and institutional resilience, and then you have minority rights. The conflict certainly affects every one of those spheres, individual liberties, and anywhere, also in the United States during the Cold War and in other times when there is a major security threat, often in democracies, that impedes all of those, spheres of freedom, and citizens often agree to that to a degree in order to maintain their security. But in Israel, obviously, individual liberties there's military conscription for at least some Israeli citizens, and there are various places in which security impinges on citizens' freedoms. I think actually less now than in the past. In terms of press freedom, there is a military censor, which is an unusual thing from an American perspective. Although the military censor, certainly if you read the Israeli press, it seems free. There are certainly, dissenting opinions are clearly free to be voiced. So the military censor, and again, this might be said to be a positive, the military censor has obviously at this time not been used to quash political dissent. It may be used to classify certain information and things like that, but it is not being used at present, as far as I can tell, as a reader of the Israeli press, to quash political dissent. In terms, I think the place where it obviously affects the democracy the most would be in terms of minority rights. And it's particularly fraught because the minority it's a large minority, it's a national minority, though it's not recognized as such. And it is the same people who are at war with the state or being occupied by the state. And so everyone understands this, but because of all these reasons, the situation with minority rights, there are limitations, there are accepted, the combination of a security threat and that situation with minority rights leads to things like open racial profiling in the airport and in other places, which is just accepted as a matter of course by citizens, by Jewish citizens. So there's quite a significant impact of the conflict in terms of limiting or problematizing democratic freedoms in Israel. At the same time, again, as Yaël mentioned, there is now not just an Arab, but a religious conservative Muslim party that was the kingmaker of the last Israeli election, and so this is not it's not a black and white case. It's not an either or, and there is a glass half full argument to be made in terms of the advances of Israel's Palestinian Arab citizens in recent years. Despite that, I think the one place, stop me if I'm going on for too long. The place where I think it's most challenging is actually, it's related to minority rights, but it's really sort of democratic values and democratic culture, in which minority rights are seen as an inherent part of justice, of the running of a just society. And I think that the occupation and the routine of now 50 plus years of non-democratic rule and unresolved conflict has really there's a large contingent within Israel. It's not the majority, but it is a very large and influential contingent within Jewish society that does not see minority rights really as legitimate, and that is a very significant problem. I would say that that's the most significant threat. I think that Netanyahu is also was threatening democracy in a number of ways, but one of his main tricks for a long time was to try and fan the flames of that resentment and of that racism and of that exclusionary populism aimed at the Arab citizens. And unfortunately, there will probably be politicians who will continue in that vein. So this is not unique to Israel. We've unfortunately seen this kind of rhetoric in the United States in recent years. You see it in many different countries, and certainly in countries with nationalist conflicts of the kind that Israel is locked in. But it is quite, I would say it's the most significant place. And the settlements, things like the tension in Sheikh Jarrah, these kind of things, just really fan the flames of that in a very painful way for those of us who want to see a democracy thriving to the greatest extent possible in Israel. If it's okay, one final thing, I had a great conversation with Rachel Azaria, who is a former member of Knesset and of the who was here in the States on a project, and she was trying to create a democratic identity for Israelis. And one of the things she said, in America, your identity is tied up in democracy. You have holidays for democracy. You celebrate your stories, your origin stories are about democracy. And in Israel, it's about identity. And it's about, security, and it's about all kinds of very meaningful things. We have religious holidays, we have national holidays, but we don't have this kind of culture or identification with democracy.
Thank you so much, Ned. That's actually a perfect transition. So back to you, Yaël. What do the threats facing Israeli and American democracy have in common? And do you think it's reasonable to draw comparisons between the two countries? And once you're finished, Ned, if we have a few minutes, we'll ask you to respond to that as well.
Yeah, thank you, Ned, for your comments also. I am not a historian or expert on American politics, so I can't speak to that. But to a large extent, I mean, I'd say I would split it up into two. There's the two distinctions. I mean, the American institutions are very different than how Israeli governing institutions work. I mean, specifically, you're probably familiar with like the lack of a constitution. So there's a set of basic laws instead that function in place of a constitution. There's a very different system of, separation of powers. In the American case, Israel only has a unicameral Knesset, so there's only one, house in the Knesset, which distinguishes it from the American case. So there's a large distinction within how the system works. I would say that we do see some of the same, manifestations of political polarization. So one of the Ned laid out really, comprehensively, I guess, the metrics that we would use to try to understand, the health of a democracy. And one of them is, the erosion of trust in governing institutions. So I'll take that as an example, as a comparative note between Israel and the US. There's an Israeli think tank called the Israeli Democracy Institute. They do very extensive polling. They have a yearly index on, the state of Israeli democracy. Their 2021 report just came out. And so one of the issues that they brought, attention to was the fact that for a large segment of the population, I mean, and it's been increasing over the last 10 years, and specifically now we're seeing it amongst the right-wing religious and ultra-Orthodox. They have very little faith and trust in the Supreme Court because they believe that the process for selecting judges is tainted by political considerations, and that these judges are, subject to political pressures, and that the whole system isn't neutral. And so we do see this also. The same discussions are happening in the American case, where, the political nature of judges' appointments is leading the public to feel that, judges are not neutral, independent, and apolitical arbiters. Specifically with the issue of the Supreme Court, it's become kind of a highlight in questions of Israeli democracy, mainly because of, as I mentioned, Netanyahu's corruption cases. So they would play a big role in deciding his future. And then another issue that I discussed in the 2019 piece, which is kind of gone away. It's not really being discussed, at least on the legislative agenda, though Yaël, who used to be the former justice minister, was a proponent. It's this thing called the override clause. So it would be, if the Knesset would pass legislation that then would require a majority, this override clause would mean that this legislation would be precluded from any judicial review. So that means basically that the Knesset's majority can enact laws that the Supreme Court then cannot overturn, based on the fact that they would be unconstitutional, as with pertains to Israel's basic laws. And so this was a big issue, specifically with legislation that Knesset was passing, in the last decade with regards to Israel's asylum seekers. So there's, a sizable population of African refugees and asylum seekers that came to Israel through Israel's southern border that were fleeing genocide from Sudan, from Eritrea. And the government had tried different ways to deal with them, to deport them, to put them into I guess open jails, and the Supreme Court would time after time again strike down this legislation by the Knesset, saying that it was unconstitutional based on one of their basic laws. So the fact that there is a lack of trust in such an important part of Israel's checks and balances system, as in the Supreme Court, I think is really troubling. I would say that also, as Americans, start to pay attention and be anxious about the way that the American system is becoming illiberal, I think it also then makes it harder for American Jews to, overlook those same illiberal issues that are happening in Israeli society and in Israeli politics. So in that sense, maybe there's also a linkage in the way that, Americans have been fighting many of the racist policies of the Trump administration, like the Muslim ban, et cetera. And as this, comes to the fore, there's also been, a recognition of similar issues in Israel. I have a lot more to say, but I guess I want to hear you, and I want to give Ned time. So
yeah, Ned, if you want to take a quick 2 minutes before we open it up to give us an answer as well.
So in terms of the parallels, I think Yaël said it very well. I mean, there are trends that are similar. And there are things that are happening both in Israel and the United States and globally. This tide of exclusionary populism, majoritarian, sort of angry majoritarian politics, fueled by social media, and things like this. This is something that's happened in many different countries, and it's been a very powerful force, and it is the reason we're all talking about democratic decline or it's one of the main reasons, I would say, at this time. So that certainly is hitting both Israel and the United States. In both cases, there is a very powerful, charismatic leader who is fueling that, and who managed to, be elected, and in Israel repeatedly elected, while focusing on a very narrow slice of the population, sort of just enough to get himself in power, and then demonizing the rest of the population. These are very poisonous things, and we can see them at work in both societies. I do think it is always very important also to stress how different the contexts of Israel and the United States are. There are, some very obvious differences between a nation, a country of 330 million people that dominates, a continent and faces no existential threats of any kind except its own mishigas, and a country of 9 million people that exists in a very volatile region and has an entirely different history and entirely different geopolitical situation. So it is important to recognize those differences and say, so we can say, maybe we can see some of the same forces at work, but they're happening in different places that face different challenges. I mean, one of the things that I think is heartening, and Yaël mentioned this, was the fact that Netanyahu failed in 4 consecutive attempts to have him, to win an election in order to end the court case against him. He came very close. It was not, the outcome was never certain, but it is, it certainly was an incredible stress test for democratic institutions in a place where we have all of these aspects of democratic culture that are threatened or weakened by the state of conflict. So the fact that the country managed so far, and I only say so far because Netanyahu is still the head of the opposition and is still still wins a plurality of the vote in any election. He still wins more votes than any other Israeli politician, and by a lot. It's just that it's about 35%. It's not enough to get him over the top, but so we should not write him off, unfortunately, from my perspective.
Thank you so much, Ned. So now in the last like 15-ish minutes, 10, 15 minutes, we're going to open it up to all of you. So if you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand. You can put it in the chat, whatever you feel comfortable doing. Yeah, Jonah, go ahead.
Thanks. Jonah from Boston. Thank you, Yael and Ned, for your time. My question is like what you see the distinction between these two different right-wing coalitions that I'm going to describe. Obviously, we've been describing the kind of right-wing coalitions in America and Israel today that we feel are undermining democracy, but right-wing governments are nothing new in Israel and America. Could you please describe what is different or distinct about like Trump's right-wing populism and maybe Netanyahu's right-wing populism that's different than maybe the right-wing coalitions amongst Republicans and Likudniks in the past, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I can start. I mean, I also, Ned, I don't want to put you on the spot for America, but I wouldn't feel comfortable answering that question only because I'm not a historian of the GOP. But in terms of we're talking about the former right-wing coalition, not right now what the National Unity Government is. I think that specifically there is, as Ned mentioned, the history of how Israel has dealt with its Palestinian national minority has been fraught, and that has always been a tension that has existed, under military occupation until 1966. But I think that at least, let's say, in the last few years of Netanyahu's control over the government, there, was a concerted effort, despite the fact that, Israel is a Jewish state and it has always been a Jewish state, to enshrine this Jewish supremacy within the Constitution. And so, I'm referring to the 2018 nation state law, which I'm sure that you're familiar with. It, kind of sounded almost banal if you really weren't paying attention to it, because it said things that, we kind of already knew were true. It was that the right to national self-determination in the state of Israel is exclusive to the Jewish people, that Hebrew, is the only official language, so it demoted Arabic from an official language. One of the issues that I think is most problematic was that it embraced Jewish settlement as a national value. And so this came up specifically in the question of, encouraging discrimination in housing in towns and cities. So where in certain municipalities, there could be, a priority for Jewish settlement. So, that is enshrining a type of, discriminatory policy against, Israel's Arab minority that we hadn't seen prior. And it, has played out in some interesting ways. There have been some cases that have, used this clause. But I think it's also, so, there's that legal element to it. And then there's also, just the sad question of how much anti-Arab rhetoric has increased. We saw, in the war that happened in May, almost unprecedented strife, interethnic strife between Arabs and Jews, in the streets, like of Jaffa, of Lod, of Akko, and I in my lifetime, I hadn't seen that type of violence. And so I think it is, I think that there is both like a normative, there's a legal shift that's happening, and there's also maybe a discursive change in how the minority issue is being dealt with. And that, I guess that's my take on it, even though I think that it's changing a lot now with the current government. So there's some positive light to work off of that.
Thanks, Yaël. I would say there are two ways that I would see, the difference between former Republican administrations or former Israeli right-wing politics and current. And this is something that I think is a parallel. And what you can see it is in all of the former leaders of either the Likud or the Republican Party who are no longer in that party. From, during the Trump era, many Republicans left or were, exiled within their own party, like Liz Cheney is right now. Liz Cheney is the daughter of the former vice president of a very hardline conservative security hawk Republican father who, Democrats loathed when he was vice president and blamed for the Iraq war and thought of as the epitome of evil. Nowadays, people like him would be seen as very, like the sort of the rational side of the Republican Party. And most of them have been kicked out anyway, or have decided to remove themselves. So that's where you can see the titanic shift. I mean, George W. Bush, I being a liberal Democrat myself, I feel a little guilty about how venomous people were towards him. He's a decent person. He made a horrific policy decision to go to war in Iraq, which, certainly he should be held accountable for. He's not a racist. He's the day after 9/11, he went to a mosque as a symbolic display to show that this is not about all Muslims, or American Muslims or anything like that. Could you imagine Trump doing something like that? So there is a very fundamental difference, and it's about, I think it is in large part, as Yaël was saying, about the relation to minorities and this sort of creating this angry, exclusionary populism, supremacist kind of ideology that wasn't necessarily part of the right wing, or wasn't part of the dominant, the leadership of the right wing. In Israel, from Netanyahu's entire generation, there's basically nobody left in the Likud. They all left. Some of them are now considered leftists, like Tzipi Livni. She was, she grew up in Beitar. She was, absolutely, from the right wing, from Cherut. Everyone, Benny Begin, Ehud Olmert, and Ruby Rivlin, who was the president, who was a lifelong Greater Israel, Likudnik, who turned out to be Netanyahu's greatest nemesis, all because he spoke. Ruby Rivlin became my hero. I mean, the guy talk about a defender of democratic values. He was the most important voice defending democratic values in the country during the Netanyahu era, and he is Likud, from the day he was born. So this is a different style of right-wing populism, and it has taken over these parties and driven out most of the people who did not have these kind of anti-democratic or aspects of their ideology. In terms of the violence that you talked about, also, it's a very sad thing. And I think, there is a parallel there, because the January 6th, what happened here, I mean, that's like nothing we've ever seen. That was completely bizarro world. But it's reality. I think in both cases, it's important to say, I think it is driven by a pretty small ideological mobilized group within each society. I do not think that kind of interethnic violence is supported not by anywhere near a majority of Jews or Arabs in Israel. There's actually been a great deal of growth in the sort of shared civil society sector between Arabs and Jews in Israel. So I think, unfortunately, it's a more militant and sophisticated, mobilized network of provocateurs and people who are building this kind of hateful movement that, you don't need a majority of people to do that. You need a committed, mobilized minority who you can get out into the streets. Unfortunately, they do have that.
Okay, I think we have time to squeeze in one quick question from Scott. He put in the chat, if you could speak briefly about the demographic divide. So are the Israeli youth becoming more democratic in their leanings as they are getting older? Again, we have about like 3 minutes left, so. And that's to either one of you. Maybe Ned, if you want to start.
Okay, I'll try to be quick then, so that no. And the answer, it's just since you mentioned the word demographics, it's pretty simple. The growing sector in Israel is Haredim, ultra-Orthodox Jews, and they are particularly they score the highest on the undemocratic views on every measure, and so their proportion of the young generation is much higher than previous generations. There is also a trending to the right to a certain degree, but I think it's mainly just driven by that demographic shift.
Yeah, I would also add there's also just a just a natural, if you look at like time series opinion polling, that there are natural generational shifts where people will become more conservative as they get older. Their positions change. I think that with regards to Israel, the interesting issue is how much has the Israeli-Palestinian conflict become still relevant in how people are voting. And I think that now we've seen it almost become, it's always in the background, but it's not an issue that is coming up at all in any of the election cycles. They're not arguing about policies about, what to do with the Palestinians. It's not about two-state solution. They're not even touching that question. The conflict doesn't come up. It comes up in many ways that we were discussing, but the parties are not putting forward any plans, at least not plans that we would look at as democratic. There were plans for annexation that came up with, at the end of Trump's and Netanyahu's, eras that was potential, and that's still an agenda of the right wing. It's still an agenda of Naftali Bennett's party, Yamina, and the large majority on the right. So I would say that the question of annexation would probably be the most challenging for the democratic leanings of the future of the Israeli constituency, and we don't see that. But as Ned mentioned, there's a growing movement of joint Jewish and Palestinian civil society. It's a group called Standing Together, Omdim Beyachad, and they have come out to work on a range of issues, from economic questions that both Jews and Arabs have to deal with, to also the national questions of the conflict. And they have been super important, specifically in the last year with regards to the war in May, and have come out all over. Usually there's like the stigma that, it's only in the Tel Aviv bubble, do like leftists come and protest, but no, they were protesting all over the country, and they've also, I think, been able to escape, some of the, political divides between left and right. So yes, I see we're all going to close, but thank you, Ned, thank you, Jaime, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Yael. Thank you, Ned.